Shekhar and Karthik and all the organizers. This is my first time at the IPF, and I'm really excited to learn a lot from all the people here. This is joint work with Sanjay Singh, who unfortunately could not be here. And if anybody's wondering about my last name, there is no relationship with the famous, the way more famous Lakdawala. Okay. So as the title of this paper says, it's a really straightforward paper. We're trying to just look at the effect of foreign shocks on the Indian economy. And in this crowd, I don't really have to motivate this very much. But let me just quickly say that we all know that for India, there's been a big increase in trade and financial linkages with the rest of the world. Okay, and more timely perhaps, as people have been following, that India is now considering issuing some more sovereign bonds, potentially denominated in dollars or something else. And so the questions we're trying to answer here is that, how important is it that international developments, how do they affect the Indian economy? And we know from basic economics that there are a lot of advantages to globalization. And so what we want to understand here are, what's the vulnerability that comes with that? Because we want to try to get a first step at kind of quantifying that. And then, of course, the eventual goal is to try and understand how should or how can policy respond to that. Okay. So what we're going to do in this paper is just look at the effect of 4 prominent shocks on the Indian economy. The first one being the US monetary policy shock. Okay. So here's why we focus on US monetary policy shock. And it's related to this idea of the global financial cycle. So in some prominent work by Helen Ray, she argues that there's this co-movement across both advanced countries and emerging countries in how asset prices and credit conditions move. And this is kind of a global phenomena that happens, which is kind of independent of what's happening individually at the country level. Okay, and in more recent work, both from Helen Ray and others have found that, in fact, what seems to be happening is that decisions by the US Federal Reserve are kind of an important source or important driver for this global financial cycle. And for us in India, we've also, if we've been paying attention, in the last few years, there have been definitely episodes where what happens in the US has big repercussions for Indian financial markets, the most prominent being with this taper tantrum episode from a few years ago. Okay, so that's the first shock that we'll consider. The second shock is an oil shock, but more specifically an oil supply shock. This is not a surprise given the dependence of India on energy. But here I want to kind of make a point that, like, at this point, we're the 3rd largest importer of crude oil. But at the same time, the amount of production that India has for crude oil is not very large, right? So our contribution to world oil production is less than 1%. So if you think about how developments in India affect the global price of oil, it's quite likely that this is going to work through a demand channel and not a supply channel. So specifically, if the Indian economy is doing well, demand for global oil could lead to change in prices. But supply disruptions in India in the production of oil are less likely to affect the global price of oil. So this helps us as economists and econometricians to help us identify the causal effect of oil supply disruptions on the Indian economy. Okay. So that's going to be our second measure of shocks. And then the third and fourth measures are got to do with this uncertainty or risk aspect. And as the CEA just mentioned, something that they've even talked about recently is this economic policy uncertainty. So we're going to look at both economic policy uncertainty and geopolitical risk. And as further motivation, there's been recent work that showed that these uncertainty effects are quite important for global financial markets. Okay. And there's also some recent work specifically looking at emerging economies that shows where India is one of those countries included in that study, that show that these uncertainty effects can be quite substantial for emerging economies. Okay, so these 4 shocks are going to make up the study today. And the key challenge here that we're going to face is that we want to estimate dynamic causal effects. Okay, so for people not familiar with this empirical macro literature, we're going to think about kind of like a dynamic simultaneous equation model. And typically the way this is modeled is that to get at these dynamic causal effects, you have to make some sort of identifying restriction in how certain variables are affected by other variables contemporaneously, for example. So just to give you a more concrete example, if you were to think about getting at the effect of oil shocks in India, and you looked at like a dynamic simultaneous equation model, like a vector order regression with Indian macro variables, and you added in the global price of oil to that model, and you tried to identify shocks to oil using this zero restrictions that people commonly put, you're most likely not going to identify the proper effect, because what you're going to capture are both demand and supply shocks. So if oil price increases are driven by demand shocks, they're going to be quite likely to be correlated with positive economic conditions even in India, and so you might not get the right effect. Okay, so if you get oil price shocks that are driven by supply effects, then the effect could be the opposite. Okay, so what we want to do is distinguish these effects, and what we're going to use in this paper is this newer methodology of identification using external instruments. So instrumental variable estimation is quite commonly used in the microeconometric literature, but even the empirical macro people are now trying to make some use of it, and I'll talk a little bit more about exactly how we do that. I'll give you just a brief overview of that, how that works. But the basic idea is that you try to bring data from outside the core set of macro variables that you're looking at to inform this identification process. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we do. So using these 4 international or foreign shocks, we're trying to just establish some simple stylized facts about what's the response of the Indian economy to these shocks. And as a simple benchmark, we want to compare how India does relative to both advanced economies and also the BRICS economies. And then I'll end with a little discussion or the relevance of this for policymakers. And just to give you a very, very quick preview of what we find that these 4 shocks are quite important for what happens in the Indian economy. Okay? And relative to advanced economies, the output in India responds less to these 4 shocks, but the output response is more comparable to what's happening in kind of these BRICS countries. Okay, so I'll show you in more detail exactly what this is. Okay, so let me jump in a little bit into this empirical framework. So like I said, the goal is to estimate dynamic causal effects of these shocks. In the macro terminology, we would call that estimating impulse responses or structural impulse responses. So in the paper, we're going to take 2 different approaches to do this. One is the vector order regression approach, which is quite commonly been used for quite a long time in the empirical macro literature. Another one, which is gaining a lot of popularity in the last few years, is based on this approach by Oscar Jorda, which is known as the local projections approach, where essentially what you do is that for each horizon that you want to calculate the dynamic effect, you run separate regressions. Okay, so without going into too much detail, in the paper we discuss, in fact, that the results that we get from both these approaches are quite similar. As I go through the results today, I'm going to focus only on the vector order regression results. I may point out a couple of times where the local projection results are a little different, but I focus on the vector order regression. Okay? And so the key thing that we're bringing to this debate here is that this idea of trying to identify these causal effects using this strategy of external instruments. Okay, so for people that are not familiar with this, you might be more familiar with the regular instrumental variable estimation in microeconometrics, where you're trying to, you have this endogenous regressor, and then you're trying to find an instrument for that. Here it's not quite the same, because you have this simultaneous equation model, and you're trying to identify structural shocks to this model. And so what you need then is an instrument that's correlated with the specific structural shock that you're interested in, but uncorrelated with all the other structural shocks. So for example, if I want to identify the effect of a monetary policy shock, then I need some instrument that's correlated with the monetary policy shock, but uncorrelated with the oil shock or with policy uncertainty shock or a government spending shock, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? I can go into more details of how exactly this works later if anybody's interested. Okay. So let me give you a little more detail about how we identify these shocks. For the US monetary policy shock, we follow the framework in this recent paper by Gertler and Karadi. And here the idea is that the instruments are constructed using high-frequency financial market data. And specifically, you look at futures prices in a narrow window around the announcements of the Federal Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve in the US. And the idea is that the futures prices are supposed to capture all expectations about what the Fed's going to do. So if they change right after the announcement, then it must be because of something that the Fed did or the Fed said. Okay? And then the other assumption that's embedded in here is that in that narrow window, here we're going to use a 30-minute window, it's unlikely that something else happened that also moved the futures market. So that's kind of your identifying assumption. Okay? And then again, without going into too much more detail, there's this controversy in the discussion of US monetary policy about these sort of information effects, which is that in addition to the statement that the Fed gives about the intentions of what they're going to do in the next meeting or a few meetings later, they may also provide some information about their forecasts for the underlying state of the economy. So we control for that using survey forecasts. Okay, so using this, we get the US monetary policy shock measure. Then for the oil supply shock, the key thing that we need to do is we have to disentangle oil supply shocks from oil demand shocks. And there's a long literature in this empirical macro on how to do it, with some seminal papers by Lutz Gideon. But there's new work by Baumeister and Hamilton, a paper just published in the AER this year, that kind of uses a Bayesian approach and says that maybe some of the assumptions that were made to separate the oil demand and oil supply shocks were too restrictive. And so they show a framework of how to put more reasonable assumptions on estimating this. So we're going to use that approach to get a measure of the oil supply shock. And then for the economic policy uncertainty and the geopolitical risk shocks, we're going to follow this Baker-Bloom-Davis. So here, what they do is they look at newspapers. So they have these algorithms that effectively read newspapers, and they count the frequency of very specific words, and they see how that frequency changes relative to some baseline over time. Okay, so for the economic policy uncertainty index, we're going to use the method, the index, the global economic policy uncertainty index of Baker, Bloom, and Davis. So prominent examples where this index spikes are the global financial crisis, going back further in the late 90s, the financial crisis in East Asia. More recently, with Brexit, there's been a big increase in this. Then the geopolitical risk index we use is based on a similar method by these people at the Federal Reserve Board, Caldara and Accoviello. And they use a similar approach where they change the specific words that they're counting in these newspapers, and based on that, they come up with an index. So prominent examples of when this geopolitical risk index spikes is consistent with what you might expect. Events like 9/11 and more recently the Paris attacks. Okay. But in addition to that, there's some new work that shows that when you try to use these policy uncertainty indices, there's a concern about measurement error. And essentially the idea is that this is supposed to capture some true underlying uncertainty, but it's measured with error. And these papers have shown that when you get that, and you use it in like a VAR setting, you tend to get a lot of attenuation bias. And so one thing that they've suggested is that instead of using the full index, what you can do is you construct an instrument where you take a dummy variable, which takes the value 1 when this index is, cyclically adjusted index is larger than a certain cutoff. Okay, so I don't go into the details here, but in these papers they show empirically and using simulations that this methodology does better than just using the index itself. Okay, so what we're going to do is construct this dummy variable as an instrument in this external instruments framework. But let me just give you a baseline of what the effects of these shocks look like. So now we're looking at a 1 standard deviation shock to these 4 shocks. And here I'm plotting the response of world industrial production. So this is the response of OECD countries plus 6 major non-member countries, which includes India. And we kind of see that these shocks have substantial impact on industrial production. The effect of the monetary policy, the economic policy uncertainty shock, and the oil supply shock is roughly similar. You're getting the magnitude is close to about 0.5% drop in industrial production. The effect of the geopolitical risk shock is a little bit smaller. To compare as a benchmark, I've kept the same axis here. For BRICS countries, these effects are a little bit smaller for the monetary policy and the economic policy uncertainty index, and also geopolitical risk. but then about the same size for the oil supply shock. So when I look at the Indian responses, I'm going to compare them both to the world industrial production response and the BRICS countries' response. Okay, so let's get to the Indian data. So these shock measures are calculated at the monthly frequency. So to be consistent with that, we're going to use monthly Indian data from January 1994 to December 2017. Okay, so for output, we use the index of industrial production. Of course, the caveat here is that this is not GDP, does not completely capture that, so that's a limitation. For inflation, we use the consumer price index, we use the rupee dollar exchange rate, the Sensex to measure the stock market index, and then we have total foreign reserves and the 10-year government bond yield. Okay. And for the VAR, there's this debate in the literature on whether you transform the variables before estimating it. We're going to follow kind of the more recent trend in this literature in just using the log level of these variables. We've estimated this model using differences. We've also done some sort of gap variables where you take kind of an HP filter or some sort of trend and detrend the variables. We get roughly similar results. So the most transparent way to see the effects is to just look at the log levels. And we have a linear time trend in here with 12 lags. Again, I'm happy to discuss more details of this later. People have questions. Okay, so let's go to the results. So this is the effect of a US monetary policy shock, one standard deviation shock. And this is the response of industrial production. So on impact, you don't see much of an effect, but then there's kind of a delayed response about the 6-month level, and it takes a little time to recover. So output is going down, prices are going down. I'll show you how this compares to the world and BRICS in a bit. But then when you look at the effect on financial markets, you see somewhat bigger effects, right? So for example, the stock market falls almost 2%. Total reserves fall, the rupee depreciates, and government bond yields fall. Okay? To get a sense of how this compares with the benchmarks that I was showing you, here the blue line is the industrial production response for India that I just showed you. The dotted red line is the response of BRICS excluding India. So now this is just BRCS countries. And then the green line is the full world industrial production response. So for a US monetary policy shock, in the beginning, the Indian response is roughly similar to what's happening across the world. But it seems that the Indian output seems to recover a little bit quicker relative to both world industrial production and the BRICS countries. Let's go to the economic policy uncertainty shock. And here again, you see somewhat similar results, which is that an adverse increase in uncertainty reduces output. Okay, it takes a little while for that output to recover. You also see kind of a fall in prices. And this fall, when we do the local projections, is actually a little bit larger and more significant. Okay? But then on the financial markets, you see very similar effects. That the stock market falls, the rupee depreciates, bond yields fall, and total reserves fall. Okay, so financial market response of the monetary policy shock and the economic uncertainty shock are quite similar. To compare the magnitudes, here the response of India, again in the blue line, is very similar to the BRICS countries, but both those responses are about half the size of what you see for the advanced economies. So for this economic policy uncertainty shock, to a certain extent, India and the BRICS countries are less affected than the advanced economies. Okay. Here's the responses of the geopolitical risk shock. Here actually we don't find much. So there is essentially the response of output is quite noisy and close to zero. We can't say much for prices either. We do see a little bit of this delayed effect, a positive effect for reserves and the stock market. Okay? And then again, when we compare this to the other benchmarks for the Indian case, we see that it's close to the BRICS countries, but this effect is much smaller than what you see for the world industrial production. And finally, the oil supply shock. And here we see a pretty big effect almost right away. Okay, so a big supply disruption that raises oil prices, lowers output quite significantly. And now, differently from the other two shocks, prices actually go up as well. Okay, so this is exactly what you'd expect with a supply shock, where prices and output are moving in the opposite direction. But again, you see still substantial effects on the financial market variables, with a reasonable reduction in the stock market and reserves, and a depreciation of the rupee. Okay. Comparing again to the benchmarks, on impact, India seems to be impacted a lot more relative to either BRICS or world or advanced economies, but then the recovery is roughly similar. Okay. So one more thing before I kind of get to the policy implications, which is that in this framework, what you can also do is something called variance decomposition. Loosely speaking, what you can do is you can, for each of the shocks that we consider, you can assign for each of the variables that we consider what fraction of the variation in these variables is explained by those shocks. Okay, so there's a lot of numbers on here. Why don't we focus in both panels on kind of the last row, okay? And so we're looking at this variance decomposition at different horizons. So this is the 1 month, the 1 year, and the 2 year horizon. And so for the oil supply shock, we see that, so I'm kind of focusing on the industrial production response. For the oil supply shock, we see that there's the biggest impact relative to the other shocks is happening instantly, which is what we saw too. But then at the more short to medium run, at the 1 to 2 year, we see both the US monetary policy shock and the oil supply shock have the biggest contribution, whereas the geopolitical risk shock and the economic policy uncertainty shock are doing less. Okay? All right. So I showed you a lot of graphs very quickly, so let me now slow down a little bit and kind of take stock of kind of what are the main messages that emerge from this analysis. Okay? So the first main message, which you can kind of see in the impulse responses and also some of the large numbers over here. So another way to think about this is that if I add up these numbers for all the 4 shocks, that's the total amount of variation that's been explained by just these 4 shocks of fluctuations in industrial production in India. Okay, so I have not looked at any sort of domestic shocks here. We're also not looking at other international shocks, just these 4 shocks. And if you add up these numbers, for example, at the 1 year mark, they explain close to 30% of the variation in output, which we thought were quite large numbers. Okay? So one kind of conclusion that we found interesting here was that these shocks are quite substantial in terms of how much they affect economic activity in India. But in addition to economic activity, they also strongly affect financial markets. Okay, but stock market, foreign exchange market, all of these are quite substantially affected by these shocks. We do find less of an effect for this geopolitical risk shock and more for the other 3 shocks, the monetary policy shock, the EPU, and the oil supply shock. In terms of the nature of the response, what we see is that the US monetary policy shock and the economic policy uncertainty shock act more like domestic demand shocks, by which I mean that when the shock hits, both output and prices move in the same direction. Okay? Whereas for the oil supply shock, you see that output and prices move in the opposite direction. Okay? And so that looks more like what we'd call as a textbook supply shock. Okay? And then the last thing was that the exposure of Indian output is lower to these shocks relative to advanced economies, but is somewhat more comparable to the BRICS countries. So another way of saying this, that there's nothing special about India relative to the BRICS countries that's making it more or less vulnerable to these international shocks. So it's somewhat similar, the response in India is somewhat similar to what's happening in these other countries. They're clearly less affected than Europe and US and those countries. Okay. So now let me try to venture a little bit more and talk a little bit about policy implications. And so the first one is that in terms of stabilization policy, for responding to oil supply shock, there's a clear trade-off, which is exactly what you'd expect with a supply shock. Right? So when an adverse oil supply shock hits, prices are going to go up and output is going to fall. So it's not clear exactly what the policymaker should do. It depends on which one they care about more. Right? Do they want to bring inflation down, or are they worried about a slowing economy? And so what they do or what is optimal will depend on the context and on the preferences of the policymaker. So this trade-off exists in responding to oil shocks, but it doesn't exist in responding to US monetary shocks and economic policy uncertainty shocks. So there, an adverse shock to either monetary policy or EPU, both lower prices and output. And so the textbook response from stabilization policy is to do some sort of expansionary policy. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Another thing that I think we found kind of interesting is that given the substantial size of the response of the Indian variables here, we also might want to start thinking about stabilization policy more, in addition to, of course, any sort of structural reforms that we might have to fix this resilience in the long run, right? So the idea is that, if we're worried about oil shocks in the long run, the answer is that we need to become more energy independent. That may involve increasing coal or promoting solar, etc. But in the short run, we still need to worry about how to respond to these shocks. And so they seem to be causing a significant amount of disruption. And so there are probably gains to be made in identifying these shocks in a timely fashion and then responding to them in what I'm calling the short to the medium run. So think kind of business cycle frequency type stuff. Okay. And so then one other thing. So now if we're thinking about this from a policy perspective, something that we couldn't do much here was to think about the response of fiscal policy. First of all, one of the limitations was that we don't have good monthly data that we could use here. It's not even clear that fiscal policy could respond in a timely manner. Something that we could think about here is the response of monetary policy. Okay, and so something that was common in all the responses here was that the size of the movement in the long rates relative to the other financial market variables was quite small. So the magnitude of the change in the 10-year bond rate response relative to, say, the stock market or the foreign exchange market was relatively small. Okay, so now, of course, in terms of the oil price shock, right, we said that there's a trade-off, right? So the fact that interest rates don't move much doesn't tell you much, because it could be that the RBI is thinking more about whether to worry more about rising inflation or lower growth. Okay, but in terms of the shocks that look more like the domestic demand shocks, there the textbook prescription of the simple canonical models would be that the central bank should lower rates and do expansionary policy. Okay, but we're not seeing that response in the data, so that raises a couple of important questions. One is, first of all, is the RBI not responding enough to these shocks? Okay. But then more kind of interestingly, even if they are responding, if they're responding by changing short rates or responding in other ways by changing regulation or something to these things, we don't seem to find any response at the long end. Okay? And so this is a discussion we were having earlier this morning, which is that it may be evidence that this transmission mechanism of monetary policy is somewhat weak here. So for example, to compare to the US, when you see changes in the short rate by the Federal Reserve, you see long-term bond yields move quite a lot. And that does not seem to be happening here. So I think that that's kind of a pretty important policy research area, is to try and figure out kind of this transmission mechanism of monetary policy. Something that I work on in the US, but I think to do this for India, there's some work, of course, already, but doing more could be very important. Okay. So let me quickly conclude, which is that basically we view this as kind of a first step in hopefully a long research agenda, which is to just do a simple empirical investigation of the effect of these shocks on the Indian economy. And hopefully we've established some stylized facts about how the Indian economy is responding to this. There are clearly ways in which that we can extend this analysis, and I have some ideas on the next slide. But hopefully this is kind of a first step towards both for policymakers to understand how to think about responding to these shocks, but also for economists and academics in terms of thinking about what are the sorts of open economy models that we should be thinking about for India. Hopefully the empirical evidence here can help the design of some of these open economy models. Okay. So I one more minute, let me just give you a few ideas of what we're trying to think about going forward, which is that, like I mentioned, we're really trying to understand kind of what's the policy response to some of these shocks, and more specifically, we can do some analysis using short-term rates to see whether they do in fact move more than long-term rates in response to these shocks. And then we're also, of course, trying to add more variables and look at a broader sort of economic variables and the response of those variables. And something that came up in discussing this idea was that, has there been any change in the responsiveness of the Indian economy since the financial crisis? One limitation we have is that we only have 20 years of data, and so trying to cut the sample one way or the other kind of highly restricts how much inference then you can do, but we're kind of interested in that. And then, of course, the natural question is that we've only looked at 4 shocks here. There are definitely other international shocks, especially things like, food, shocks to the price of food, or shocks originating in trading partners in Asia that could be important over here.
Behir Desai is our first discussant.
Welcome. Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed this paper. So I have a couple of quick thoughts that are fairly straightforward about this. Karthik mentioned different models for IPF papers, and one that he mentioned was the kind of grand synthesis, which is a great model. I think what we have here is the other type of great kind of IPF paper, which is the big fact, kind of the big facts kind of paper. And so this is an effort to bring together state-of-the-art methods, a big question, which is the effect of foreign shocks, and hopefully some big facts. And in a sense, the paper is incredibly simple and straightforward. There's 4 big shocks: U.S. monetary policy, oil supply, economic policy uncertainty, and geopolitical risk. And then there's a whole bunch of outcome variables. And as a consequence, you're guaranteed to have something interesting to say. You have kind of 24 things you're looking for, and something's going to pop. And indeed, things do pop. There is underneath this a sense of having some real variables and then having some prices and some financial markets. I think the paper could benefit from being more distinct about that and thinking about real versus financial in a more concrete way. And then, of course, ultimately, one of the punchlines is it's up to a third of the variance in some of these outcome variables over 2 to 4 year horizons. I think some of the comments I'll make have already been addressed, I think, by the presentation, which has a couple of things that weren't in the original paper. And they are a little bit about tone and a little bit about content. So first, I think the paper might benefit from being reorganized more specifically around real versus financial outcomes, and thinking a little bit about, if you can just keep this up, that would be the slides up. There's a producer who's being born back there who's just dying to do the controls. So I think if you could be more clear about specifying real versus financial, I think that'd be helpful. And then frankly, to my taste, I'd be more interested in the real side of this, and I would much rather see, in some sense, diving more deeply into the elements of industrial production that are moving and thinking a little bit harder about that, as opposed to doing the kitchen sink on a bunch of financial variables. The way the paper is written, as opposed to the way it was presented, are slightly distinct, right? So the way the paper is written is that the world and the BRICS pictures are ways to talk about, well, is this valid? Are the shocks valid? I think it's more interesting to do more what you did during the presentation here, which is we should think about it as a relative measure of Indian vulnerability. And that's not really done in the paper currently. It was a little bit more mentioned in your talk. Said another way, I actually, and this will cut to a point below, I confess I took away the opposite kind of story from your paper, which is your story is there are these foreign shocks and they're highly disruptive to the Indian economy and blah, blah, blah. And my headline to the paper would have been the remarkable resilience of the Indian economy. So I suppose that's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. I came in with a prior, which was actually the Indian economy is highly levered to the global economy. At previous IPFs, I've tried to make that comment. So if anything, I revised my priors in that direction, which is, God, it's actually a lot more resilient. And people who've been talking about how 8% GDP is possible, regardless of what the economy is going to go, global economy is going to do, are right. So I guess it's a little bit of a difference in the way you think about this. I'll come back and talk about that more. Second, I think in terms of these actual shocks, I think, this is the picture that we were shown. I mean, I think in this kind of a setting, these pictures need to be highly annotated and elaborated. So I want to know what's going on inside these pictures. So showing us these pictures is unsatisfying. I think, on the US monetary policy, I think I can see the financial crisis there, which is nice. But I would blow it out, I would annotate it, and I would make sure that the periods that are being highlighted here are actually periods that are interesting, so that there's something interesting going on. So I would want to see these, and of course I would want to know a lot more about the relationship between the variables. So you're letting the econometrics do a lot of heavy work in the background, but I just want to know some simple things. If I overlay this on that, do they look a lot alike? And they seem to. And so I would want to know something like that with a little bit more rigor. And same thing with the geopolitical risk and the economic policy uncertainty variables. I think these shocks, you can tell where your heart is, right? So the monetary policy uncertainty variable is done with great care and is very thoughtful. It has futures prices, and then you take the innovations in the futures prices and you cleanse it by looking at it and you regress it against its lags and a whole bunch of other possibilities, and then you have a really good feeling about that variable. Now, in contrast, the economic policy uncertainty and the global policy uncertainty, I'm always deeply skeptical about these citation counts, and they feel like citation factories, so I don't know what people are doing always with those kinds of variables, and even the kind of instrumental version of it is really just a dummy variable for a kind of higher level of it. So it doesn't feel as rigorous as what you're doing in these other settings. And so in some ways, I really like the oil supply shock. I really like the monetary policy stuff. And I found these two risk measures amorphous and unsatisfying. And I'm not even sure what they're really trying to capture. So I would, in a sense, I'd prefer to see something that's more on the monetary policy side and the oil supply stuff. The oil supply stuff you don't explain in the paper. I think it could benefit from being explained a little bit more, and that would be helpful. And then I would love to see something about time trends and regimes. I think one of the underlying themes would be that we've become less exposed, and I don't know if that's true or not, so understanding that over time would be really, really helpful. Just to go back to the to the pictures, is the headline of the paper kind of substantiated by the underlying data? And this is more, this is kind of what you do for monetary policy and oil. First, in terms of the magnitudes, are these large? I don't know. I didn't really necessarily think so. I mean, I came away from this thinking, gosh, monetary policy and innovations, if I look down at that bottom right-hand corner on the left side, this is not a very significant change. Even on prices, even on stock market levels, I didn't see large changes, not nearly what I might have expected with a one standard deviation change in these measures. So, yeah, these are disruptive, but again, it's a matter of your priors. To my eye, I look at a lot of this and I say to myself, this is not disruptive nearly as much as one would have expected, and in fact, the recoveries are quick. Oil supply being an exception, by the way. I think oil supply on the industrial production, you're seeing something that's interesting and real. But otherwise, I'm not sure this is big. Now, this is the way I organized the paper and what you kind of did in one of your presentations, right, but isn't in the paper now, which is this is the world, that's BRICS, and this is India on monetary policy shocks. So it goes world, BRICS, and India. And, first, just worthwhile noticing, the big surprise to me is that the world is the most sensitive, BRICS the less so, and India even less so. So that's kind of a headline. I don't understand that. It's not clear to me why that would be. Second, these are baskets of countries, and India is a single country. And so it's even more surprising. So BRICS, as one example, has, if you look at the oil supply shock, has Russia in it. So now I'm really kind of puzzled. So I think if we want to use these things as benchmarks, which is the right way to think about them, as opposed to just validation of are the shocks real, then I would want to do it at the single country level, and I'd want to see what Brazil looks like, and I'd want to see what Malaysia looks like. I want to see what some of these other countries look like, and then we can talk about the relative resilience or fragility of the Indian economy. Similarly, on the oil supply shock, again, I would have expected India to be much more sensitive than other parts, of the world, and that's not really showing up. We do see sensitivity, but it's not showing up in a significantly greater way. And again, these are bundles of countries, not single countries. It's even more surprising in that sense. So, altogether, I came away thinking about the headline of the paper being the resilience of the Indian economy, and I guess I'd like to know why that's not the right headline as opposed to the headline that you're drawing. And then final thing to say is, on this, I guess I confess the variance decomposition stuff is really hard to interpret. And I think, as you acknowledge in the paper, that's an extreme upper bound on what these effects are. So when you add them all up, which is what this exercise is at the end, he's getting more than a third of the variance at 4-year horizons in industrial production is being accounted for by these 4 shocks. So I think, as yourself, you acknowledge that's a way upper bound. We know when we do these analyses, they can easily add up to more than 100%. So it's a little bit of an unsatisfying kind of piece of analysis. And again, I kind of in some sense reach the opposite conclusion. I say, even with all this, I say to myself, really? Like, you add it all up and you get a third of the variance decomposition to kind of maybe be associated with these 4 big shocks? And again, I guess my instinct is to kind of conclude more about the resilience of the Indian economy than the fragility of it. But as I mentioned, it's a really interesting paper. It does the big facts really well. It's one of these wonderful papers where you don't actually, no disrespect intended, but you can literally just go to the back of the paper and look at the figures. You don't have to read the paper. It's spectacular. It's literally that kind of paper, and I mean that as a compliment, not as a criticism. But yeah, so great. Thanks.
Our second discussant, coming on the paper now, is Pani Dua.
A very good morning to everyone here, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to serve as a discussant. I don't have a presentation, so I will simply describe what I have to say, and with some risk of repetition from the previous discussion. Let me first congratulate the authors for a very competent piece of work and also using state-of-the-art econometric techniques. Of course, we know that in the backdrop of increasing globalization, the susceptibility of the Indian economy to external shocks is rising. And in this context, the authors examine the impact of external shocks, that is the US monetary policy, oil supply, global economic policy uncertainty, and geopolitical risks on the Indian economy. They analyze the dynamic causal effects of these shocks on output, inflation, foreign exchange reserves, exchange rate, government bonds, and stock prices. The estimation consists of external instrument strategy with local projections and structural vector autoregressions. And the results highlight the impact of these global shocks on the economy and financial markets of India. So I will divide my comments in 3 parts. One is to do with the data that is used and the construction of variables. And the second is the estimation methodology that is used. And then lastly, I will look at the results. So first, the data and construction of variables. Now, in the introduction section, the authors mentioned that since India accounts for a large share of total world oil consumption, changes in India's demand for oil are likely to be an important driver of the global price of oil, and so on. Now, if I look at the data from US Energy Information Administration, what I find is that India is a significant player, but it is a small player. If we compare India to the US, which has a 20% share, China 13%, and the European Union about 15% in the oil market. And therefore, changes in India's demand for oil may not be major drivers of the global price of oil. Now, my second comment on the construction of variables is on the construction of economic policy uncertainty and geopolitical risk measures, which are based on news events. Now, since these are based on news events, these are actually media perceptions. These are perceptions about policy uncertainty and political risks. And it is not so clear whether these measure the true underlying uncertainty. And so in this, what the authors do is they recognize that there is a measurement error, and they correct for that using dummy variables. So still, we have to bear in mind that we are measuring perceptions, and I am not sure whether this correction of the measurement error fixes the problem. And therefore, my suggestion is that maybe one can try out an alternative measure of uncertainty. I'm not sure if that's possible, but one can try for robustness of results if we can have some other measure. Now, another comment on the measurement of variables is to measure the monetary policy indicator, the authors use the 10-year government bond rate. And normally we find that studies use rates at the shorter end, like call money rate or 3-month treasury bill rate, and now, of course, the repo rate as a monetary policy indicator. And the problem with using the 10-year bond is that it is possible that the central bank may be able to move the yield curve only at the short end. And I think that is why, or that may be one of the reasons that you are getting weak transmission of monetary policy. I'm not claiming that transmission is very strong anyway, but the fact that it is the long end of the yield curve is a little bit problematic here. Now, coming to the estimation part of this, so to construct the monetary policy instrument, the authors follow the Nakamura and Steinson method and use the first principal component of the change in the contracts. Now, if you look at the work done by Gurkenak, the 2005 paper, Gurkenak with others, so what they show is that monetary policy is captured by 2 dimensions, change in the federal funds rate and change in forward guidance. And then they use the Craig-Donald test and suggest that 2 factors should be included in the model. And what they find is that these 2 factors explain more variation in the surprises than a single factor. So it may be useful to see if the 2 factors would help to improve the results that the authors have from a single principal component. Then some other minor comments regarding the estimation. On page 12, the authors report using an HP filter, and we know the problems with the HP filter, that this can create spurious cycles, and therefore the robustness of the results can be checked against other better filters. Then also the identification strategy for the structural VAR is not described in the paper. And the authors may also look into the issue of, are there any puzzles that are emerging from this? the authors also use the Cholesky decomposition. So what has to be noted here is the drawbacks of this decomposition, which is that it is order dependent. Now, moving on to the estimation results, and what I will do is I will borrow from the picture of the previous discussion, Mayor, that you did the monetary policy shocks against US, BRICS, and India. And if you go back to that picture, or if you remember that picture, then what we find is that for India, there is a positive impact on IIP at t equals 0, and then it is becoming negative in the long run, whereas for the others it is positive. So why do we find this difference? Why is it becoming negative in the case of the Indian economy? Then if we want to study the impact of shocks on the Indian economy, then we have to have some benchmark, like what are the various episodes that have happened in the Indian economy in terms of slowdowns or recessions. Recessions have not been that frequent, but one can have some sort of chronology of growth rate slowdowns in the economy, and then you can measure the impact versus those episodes of slowdown. And so this, my comment on the Indian chronology of slowdowns is similar to what Meher had said about the US peak, the spike that we were getting in the financial crisis. So there we have the recession periods of the US. So one can look at the business cycle recessions of the US as well, but both will give you a better idea of what is the impact of the shock. Now, one more comment on the results is that we find that the stock markets are impacted even in the long run. And so I'm not sure if that is a little bit odd, because that typically stock markets don't show that much sensitivity to shocks in the long run. So in the near term and possibly medium term, one would find, but I am not sure how to explain the sensitivity in the long run for stock markets. And this result is also for the bond markets. But for bond markets, maybe one can argue. And one question about the bond markets was that are these for primary markets or secondary markets? So I think that may also make some difference to the analysis. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm going to exercise my prerogative as chair to ask the first question or two, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and I will leave several minutes at the end for Emmett to basically sum up his reactions to all this. And I guess I want to step back for a minute and think about policy in this connection. I want to think about whether we want to worry about policy variability and how it's costly and all that, and I'm sure we do, and I think this is a very useful step toward it. But if I were thinking about policy, I'd also want to think about domestic shocks. And one kind of really interesting question, which is bigger, and I wouldn't expect you to answer, is, for example, are domestic shocks greater or less than what would happen if you were a closed economy? What about domestic shocks? And in connection with domestic shocks, given my potted knowledge of India, I would have thought that the monsoons or possibly the biggest shock one gets at the end of the economy. And I seem to recall a cyclone a couple of years ago that did a lot of damage on the southeast coast and so on and so forth. And then if you think policy, you say, well, if we want to cut down on the output variability, for example, which is going to be the least cost way to do it? Will it be indeed to do something on the oil price, and I'll come back to that in a minute, or would it be do something more about irrigation? Or something else smooths the flow of agricultural product? I don't know the answer, but it seems to me before we get to policy, it might be well to at least think about the domestic shocks that come in. And what about shocks on the upside? Are there no upside shocks? Do we want to worry about whether they create inflation or any of those things? I don't know, but it's sort of the background to the paper, not the paper itself. The only other thing I wanted to say, ask, and this is a real question because of my inadequate knowledge of India, I suppose, but it's my understanding that the government did a lot to stabilize the domestic oil price, and that indeed the budget deficit in India went up when the oil price went up because the subsidies were bigger. And if that's the case, then what you're getting is not the oil price per se, you're getting the combined effect of the oil price and the fiscal deficit, in which case it's, I think, subject to something of a different interpretation, although I'd have to think it out. Let me open up the floor, not monopolize what time we have. I see one hand down here. Yeah, you.
Hi, Amit. I really enjoyed your presentation. I just have a couple of questions and comments. So when I think about monetary policy shock coming from the US, if you just think of the transmission channel, presumably what's happening if the Fed is announcing a monetary tightening, then there's capital outflows happening from the emerging markets, including India, and that would depreciate the exchange rate. So I think a very important variable in the transmission mechanism is capital flows, and I saw that was missing in your SVAR model. Because if you're missing the capital flow, then that's a key link of how the shock is getting transmitted. The second variable is when there is a capital outflow and the exchange rate is depreciating, what the Reserve Bank is presumably doing is increasing the interest rate in order to counter that shock. And as a result of that monetary tightening, our inflation and IIP are responding. So again, the second missing variable would be the Reserve Bank, the repo rate that is being changed. If you're not including these two in the SVAR, then the transmission to especially inflation and IIP from a monetary policy shock is a little bit far-fetched, I would say. The second point is, and this is what Professor Pamidu also mentioned, is that the persistence of the effect on the financial market, I was quite surprised to see such a long persistence, because I would think that if you're getting such a long effect, then there are other confounding factors which could be causing the same effect, depending upon how you have done the identification, etc. Because what we find is the shock effect is not more than a week when we look at stock market or bond market. And the third point I have is when you're including reserves, but reserves may also be affected by valuation effect because the exchange rate is also fluctuating. What might be better to look at is the foreign exchange intervention by the RBI in response to the shocks, and if that is showing any change at all. But I wouldn't say that is more of an important factor. The important factor is the effect of that on exchange rate and so on and so forth. Okay. Thank you.
Rakesh?
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. My remark is actually a continuation of Mihir's remarks, which is that it is what does come out is the greater resilience of the Indian economy to these shocks than the comparators, which are the BRICS in the world. And in some sense, what would be interesting further work is to think of why that is the case, which is really what Mihir was saying. And perhaps one could look at measures of capital account openness or current account openness, trade openness. Also, as Rajesh was just saying, some measures of domestic policy responses. So, for example, after the taper tantrum, the Reserve Bank took very active measures to get new capital flows by special arrangements with the banks for NRI deposits, etc. And that is, in some sense, that's almost always been the case whenever there's such a shock. And so I think that's the sort of direction in which would be very interesting. And then perhaps if one can then compare with the other individual BRICS countries, in terms of the differential, in terms of shocks. So I think that's sort of what is interesting, what is coming out of the paper in terms of policy. And as a footnote, the CEA talked about the floating of the proposed new sovereign bond, And the question, that's the kind of question that is interesting, is that if the country does that, will it become more susceptible to shocks? And whether one can throw any light on this through this kind of work.
Thank you. Okay, I can't see who this is down here. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. I can't read it, can't see.
For one shock which surprised me that your paper didn't follow was on agricultural prices, global agricultural prices. Indian farmers gained enormously between 2006 and 2012 when the agriculture price cycle globally went up. Conversely, they've been hit very badly in the past few years when it's gone down. And that, I think, would have a far greater impact than many of the other shocks for which you're looking at.
Good.
The shocks and the impacts symmetric? So is everything, is there a way in the framework to think differentially about impacts of increases versus decreases? And you didn't discuss any of those differences at all. And the second is, you can interpret this as a measure of vulnerability, but you could also think about this as a residualized measure of effective integration with the global economy. And so that gets me to Mihir's question about, rather than levels, I'd also really be interested in just seeing the trends of exactly these measures over time and what that, so I mean, my main concern is the best way to not be vulnerable is to not be integrated. And so is there a way that you take the wrong, one takes the wrong interpretation from some of this vulnerability work to think about, oh, we reduce vulnerability, it's good, but maybe that's coming at the opportunity cost of not picking up greater upsides when you are in fact more integrated. And so, how do we think about that relative to the overall? And so just the context of integration. And then the last related point, and I think I was thinking commodities and other things as well, but I know you've got this problem of anticipation versus and everything relative to future prices. But in principle, I think commodities, you could do that with a broader set of commodities, or anything that has a futures market, would still allow you to do that. And so just like Mihir said, that's like a really good way for capturing what you're doing on monetary policy shock. But in principle, that could be done for the other shocks as well. So.
Is that Abhijit hiding back there?
I think most of what I was going to say has been said. I want to pick up on this point that I think Karthik just made, which is that whether it's vulnerability or just lack of integration is, I think, key. Which is it that this reflects the fact that bunch of the economy is just disconnected. Now, the one fact that weighs against that is the oil price shock. The oil price is very well integrated into the Indian economy. In fact, it's political. So my guess is that there's some combination of that and what Rajeshwari said about the other set of responses. I think what the government often does, in fact, is rather than cutting the deficit, it changes the composition of fiscal expenditure. And I think the composition of fiscal expenditure responds very strongly to short-term fluctuations. So I think that's one of the things to look into, is whether we are kind of sacrificing long-term investment at these moments to keep everything else stable. I think that I always have a hard time understanding exactly what we are keeping fixed when you look at one of these coefficients, because it's it's a shock, but it's also integrates over all the expected responses to the shock and the ones that actually happen, and that all of that kind of makes it very hard to think of how to use that for policy purposes, because some of that has already been built into it. One extreme, the government of India is infinitely wise and does the exactly right thing. And that's the best thing you can do, given the other constraints which you haven't modeled. How do I know that that's not what's happening? In some ways, you want to document. That's, I think, goes back to the texture part of Mihir's comment, which is give us a little bit more texture on what's going up and what's going down within the government's budget, within maybe the composition of private investment. Just understanding a bit more about what's happening there, because otherwise there's always the kind of the Panglossian interpretation that this is the best of all possible worlds. It's not inconsistent with what you show.
Monte?
Thanks, Anne. Just very briefly, and I apologize because I came a little late, but I've kind of browsed through the paper, which is very interesting. You know, it struck me that the impact of shocks on variables of interest is actually a function of policies. And in a way, the question that must be at the back of everybody's mind is, would a different set of policies have given a better outcome? Now, one of the problems I have is that two of the things you use to measure shocks, reserves and exchange rates, are actually policies. So, for example, if a particular shock leads to a decline in reserves, is that a good thing? Should they have protected the reserves? And the same thing is true of exchange rates. So how about partitioning in that way? Is that at all possible? I don't mean instantly, but maybe in your future research, to address that question. And to my mind, I would treat both reserves and the exchange rate as intermediate things of interest, which are actually policies. Particularly, I mean, since the Reserve Bank, it has a very complicated formula to describe what it does, which is meant to both allow it to do something and to completely deny it if necessary. But it's very clear that they do something. Thanks.
Thanks, Monte. The exchange rate is often thought as a buffer, in fact, against shocks, and you let the exchange rate move in order to offset them. Okay, first, Shekhar's been waiting a long time, and then I'm going to just over here.
It was partly picked up by Karthik already, that we may be missing the upside to some extent in thinking about this, and it relates also to what just Montek said. I was curious, and of course, I know the restrictions on people in the Monetary Policy Committee, but since we have Pamit here from the MPC, just some reflection on how the MPC thinks about some of these issues would be very valuable for some of us, to the extent that you can, of course, talk about it.
Okay, well, let me take Rajneesh as the last question, and then we can come back to the panel, okay? Rajneesh.
I view your paper as a very important statistical exercise, documenting the effect of foreign shocks on Indian macroeconomic aggregates. But for policy implications, I'd like to see some measures of welfare analysis. What I have in mind is that you've got some fluctuations in output being induced by these shocks, and something along the lines of a Lucas model where you could look at consumption equivalents or something to see what is the magnitude, before we go into policy implications. Because one of these things would be, as a finance person, I would think you want to hedge some of these things, and hedging is always costly. So you have a cost-benefit analysis as to see how you would hedge these things and how much you would be willing to pay to hedge these, especially oil shocks and the like. Thank you.
Okay. Let me then turn back, and we'll let you have a chance, David.
Yeah, thank you all for some fantastic comments. Overall, I think that the quality of the comments were really good. So let me try to answer some of them. So I think that both Mihir and Pami pointed out that the identification of the two uncertainty or risk shocks is potentially not as rigorous as the other two, and I completely agree with that. It's not clear that I can really push more in that dimension. So maybe making that more explicit in the paper, saying that these are kind of the concerns. So I completely agree with that. Then going back to this, how do you interpret this? So you're right that the prior, I guess, we had coming in, some of it was informed more from a little bit reading the literature on in this empirical macro field, where some of the results were kind of noisy and not so conclusive in terms of finding any sort of substantial significant effects. So we were kind of informed by that point of view, and so our kind of conclusion was like, look, hey, we're finding something substantial here. But you're right, that especially if we compare to the benchmarks, this could very well be a story of India being a lot more resilient. And I'm not I'm not against that perspective at all. Just trying to explain what we were thinking going into that. But in general, so trying to think also about the resilience, this issue of how has policy responded, and so Rajeshwari's points are really well taken, which is that it's kind of on our to-do list, which I put on the last slide, which is to add both capital flows in there to really understand kind of, have policymakers responded by trying to stem outflows, what happens to the budget deficit in response to an oil shock. Some of the things we can get monthly data on, some not as much, especially on the fiscal side. So a lot of the limitation was we just don't have that data at a monthly level. Now, in this analysis, there's kind of two ways to get at the lower frequency data that we have, like say GDP. One thing you could do is some sort of interpolation to get it down to a monthly level. On the other hand, you could take your shocks and aggregate them up to a quarterly level. Both those frameworks have issues. You have to make some strong assumptions. So we didn't want to do that at taking a first stab at this. But yeah, all these points are really well taken. That this policy response is very important. I have a lot more things to say. Do you want to take some time to respond to potentially the most important question that was raised? If not, I can answer some more questions. Yeah.
All right, I'll try to be very brief, but my colleague Chetan is also here, and if he wants to say a few things after I've said, he can add to it. In the Monetary Policy Committee, we follow an inflation targeting framework. So we have a band of headline inflation 4 plus minus 2%, and in trying to maintain this, I think we analyze all the shocks at a given point in time, and what the chairperson said about agriculture, that's a very important factor that is taken into account. And the shocks that are mentioned here all have appeared at different points in time, like the oil price shock, and then right now global slowdown and the geopolitical risks globally. All of these have been discussed in MPC and have also been documented in the various resolutions of the MPC over time, and as well as our own individual statements on the state of the economy. And the point that is of importance and which we are not able to control fully is, in fact, we are not able to control is the transmission. Like if we decrease interest rates or increase interest rates, will it have the desired effect? And that always remains a question mark. And so that is why when I pointed out about the 10-year government rate, I quickly added that I'm not claiming that if you use a shorter rate, you will get transmission, because that is a question mark. And, so if I can request if Chetan wants to say something. No? Okay. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.